What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
I was driving home from a late shift, brain running on fumes and coffee, when my phone buzzed with a family group text that looked harmless at first glance and then landed like a punch once my eyes caught the words my sister had typed with her usual cheerleader punctuation. Because she wrote that this year Christmas would be small and intimate and focused on celebrating the high achievers of the family, which, translated from Carla's special dialect, meant that I was off the guest list because apparently I did not fit the brand anymore, and I just sat there for a minute in the driveway with the engine clicking and the screen lighting up my hands, reading it again to make sure I was not hallucinating and then reading it a third time because I could not decide what was worse, the phrasing or the fact that my parents were in the thread and had already responded with little clapping words and a heart, as if this idea had been carefully discussed and approved in a committee where I was the only item on the chopping block. I typed out something measured, because I have learned the hard way that when you deal with Carla you say less than you want but more than nothing, so I asked since when Christmas came with a dress code and a spreadsheet, and Carla answered right away with a chirpy tone you can hear even through plain text, saying it was nothing personal, that she just wanted the night to be positive and forward-looking, and that my energy lately felt heavy and, honestly, a bit self-focused. Which made me laugh out loud in one of those dark little ways that is not pretty, because if there is a person in this family who feeds on applause and cannot walk past a mirror without giving herself an internal standing ovation, it is my sister with the perfect teeth and the curated life who still calls me when her printer jams, when her kid is sick, when a bill looks scary, when a contractor tries to upsell her, when any adult consequence taps her on the shoulder and she needs someone who will not flinch. My mother chimed in after a long silence that felt strategic, telling me not to make drama and to let Carla host the way she wanted, and that we could do something together another time. Which was such a neat little sentence that you could almost miss what it actually says, because it says that I can eat leftovers and keep my voice down and be grateful I still get a Tuesday lunch like a consolation prize. And I could feel that part of me that always smooths things over start to wake up and reach for a rational explanation, the same part that writes checks and keeps receipts and calls billing departments and makes sure my parents' copays do not blow up into something that wrecks their credit. The part that has convinced me for years that being the reliable one is noble and adult, but then another part, quieter and meaner and more honest, stood up and asked a very basic question that I had somehow never let myself ask out loud, which is why exactly I am underwriting a family that cannot even keep a chair for me at their table. I did not respond to the thread again, because I could feel the trap closing. You apologize for something you did not do, you promise to be lighter, you show up bearing gifts like a visiting employee trying to keep her job, and I am not doing that anymore. So I put the phone face down and sat with the first clean thought I had had in months, which was that nobody gets to grade my value while living off of my discretion, and that I have spent too many years hiding the paperwork of my generosity so that Carla could play queen without getting her hands dirty, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the most positive and forward-looking thing I could do for myself was to step out of the role they had assigned me without asking. Here is the part people always want to know, whether it hurt, whether I cried, whether I raged, and the truth is it felt like taking off a backpack I did not realize weighed as much as it did. Because once I decided I did not need to argue with them about my place in the family photo, every little administrative skill I have, and I have plenty, the unglamorous kind that pays bills on time and keeps people healthy, clicked into a plan that was not dramatic or petty, just precise and fair, and I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter, logged into the insurance portal where I am listed as the responsible party for both of my parents, because years ago nobody else would deal with the forms. And I changed the billing preference from my card to paper statements sent to the house where the clapping hearts live. And I removed my saved payment method, so there would be no accidental charges slipping past me while I was busy being not successful enough for the roast and the toast. Then I called the specialty pharmacy that ships my father's maintenance medication, the one I have coordinated for years so he never misses a refill. And I told the woman in the calm voice I use at work that the payer on file needed to be updated to the primary insured and that I would no longer be authorizing shipments, which she noted carefully. adding that future deliveries would require confirmation and that any balances would be billed to the household address, and I thanked her because none of this was her fault, and I made one more call to the hospital billing office to ask them to remove me as the guarantor on the orthopedic account that still pops up with little charges after a minor procedure last spring, and the representative, who probably has heard every family story under the sun, said she understood and that they would send a new statement to the patient for verification, and I hung up feeling, for the first time in a long time, aligned with myself instead of indebted to a version of me that exists only to keep other people comfortable. I did not text the group to announce any of this, because that would have turned it into a fight they could frame as cruel or impulsive, and I am not cruel and I am not impulsive. I am methodical and tired and finally awake. So I just wrote a short private note to Carla that said I would not be attending because I did not want to bring down her vibe, that I wished her a night full of all the success she could fit into a living room, and that going forward anything related to our parents' bills should be handled directly by them as they see fit, and I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and made myself a late dinner, and as I ate I realized that I had knocked over the first domino without needing to raise my voice or explain a thing, which is its own kind of justice. By the time I rinsed my plate and set it in the rack, I had a new voicemail from my mother that started with my name in that tone she saves for emergencies and ended with a sentence that made the hair on my arm stand up. Not because it was cruel, but because it told me exactly how far they were willing to go to keep the illusion alive, and as I pressed play and listened, I understood that Christmas had just become a negotiation, and that I was finally the one setting the price. The voicemail from my mother started with that careful softness she uses when she wants something, the kind that pretends nothing is wrong while her voice tries not to shake. And she said there must be a misunderstanding with the medication service, because a package had not arrived and my father was counting on it, and maybe I could call and sort it out like I always do. And then she threw in a line about how the holidays make everyone sensitive, and how Carla did not mean anything by her message, and I stood there listening to it twice, not because I needed clarification, but because I wanted to hear the exact moment when the performance cracked and she let herself sound worried. And there it was, right after she said, always, a tiny breath, a pause. The sound of a person realizing the invisible hand that has been holding up the roof has just closed into a fist and put it in her pocket. This is the part nobody in my family ever wants to hear, but I am going to say it out loud because pretending otherwise keeps me sick. Which is that for years I have been the person who knows which plan covers which doctor, and which referral code unlocks which visit, and which billing office will reverse a charge if you ask for the right department in the right tone. And while everyone likes to act like money is crude and tacky to mention, none of them had a problem letting me funnel my paychecks into their emergencies, so if we are going to tally success, let us at least count the nights I spent on hold untangling their messes, the weekends I drove across town with folders full of papers, the times I quietly paid a balance so a procedure would not be postponed, and the moments I let my own plans sit in the back seat so my parents could keep pretending that everything was fine and that Carla's curated milestones were the natural fruit of talent and drive rather than the product of a family subsidy that arrived without a bow. Carla once told her friends at a brunch, because word gets around, that I was very sweet but not very ambitious, that I liked helping and keeping things simple, and I laughed when a cousin repeated it. Not because it was funny, but because it was so cleanly upside down that it almost impressed me, the way a magician can convince you he is pulling a coin from your ear while he is taking the watch off your wrist. And I remember thinking even then that the story only works because I never contradict it, that I am the quiet one who pays and files and nods and shrugs, and that maybe I have been using confidence as a mask to avoid a fight I should have started a decade ago. So I opened my email and began searching for the proof I never meant to use, and there it was, a breadcrumb trail that ran for years, confirmation notices from insurance portals, itemized statements, reminders of auto payments I set up when my father went through a rough patch after a layoff, and nobody wanted to talk about cash flow because it felt shameful, and I remembered how my mother looked relieved when I told her I would take care of it, how she squeezed my hand and said she would make it up to me, How she started talking about me like I was a saint, which sounds nice until you realize sainthood is just a way to keep you quiet and available. And I sat there scrolling and collecting and dragging everything into a neat folder with dates and names and totals, not because I am planning to blast it on a billboard, but because when people rewrite your story, you need to anchor yourself to facts or you will drown in their version. I drafted a simple message to my mother, keeping my voice level because anger makes them stop listening and I want this recorded, and I wrote that I received her voicemail and understood the situation. That the pharmacy and the hospital now require direct authorization from the primary insured and payments from the household, that I would not be intervening or providing my card, and that any appointments or refills would need to be scheduled and funded by them, and I ended with a line that felt like both a boundary and a kindness, which said that if they wanted help learning how to manage the portals and the bills, I could show them one time, like a training, and after that they would be independent, and I left it at that, because I am done being the default. Carla called from a masked number not even 10 minutes later, which made me smile because the queen of image management does not like leaving fingerprints. And she launched into this upbeat pitch about how she probably sounded clumsy in the group text and how she was trying to create a certain kind of evening and how of course I am part of the family, and the whole time I could hear a faint tapping in the background, probably her refreshing her banking app, and I told her that I was not angry, and that I appreciated her candor because it clarified something I should have noticed earlier, which is that we are all adults and everyone can handle their own business, and she said that sounded harsh, and I said it sounded accurate. And she tried to pivot to a guilt trip about our parents' health, but I cut that off because I have carried that card for too long and it is expired, and I told her I would email her a short list of what needed to happen for the prescriptions and the billing to be reconnected under their names, and that was the end of the call because she realized she could not charm her way past a system that now requires her to show up with a wallet rather than a compliment. Then, because I am not careless and I do not bluff, I called my bank and set a fraud alert and requested a new card, not because I think they would steal from me, but because people who feel entitled get creative when their safety net disappears. And I do not intend to spend January disputing charges from medical offices I no longer authorize, and I also checked my credit file to confirm that I am not listed as a co-signer on anything unexpected. And finding everything clean felt like finally closing a door that has been swinging open in the wind for years, and I sat there breathing slowly, realizing that I was not punishing them so much as correcting a system that rewarded me for being invisible and punished me when I dared to speak. My email pinged with a reply from my mother, short and clipped, asking if I could just spot them this month because the timing was tough and they did not want to interrupt care. And I read it 3 times and then wrote back that I understood and that I would help in a different way, and I attached a 1-page guide I wrote in plain language explaining exactly how to log in, what to click, where to enter a card, whom to call if they got stuck. And at the bottom I wrote that I would be available on one afternoon to walk them through it, in person, once, and after that I expected them to manage it like the successful household they claimed to be, and I hit send and closed the laptop. And as I stood to refill my glass, I realized I had just pulled the thread that holds their favorite story together, the one where I am dependable and quiet and always available, and that the unraveling had already started because my phone lit up again. Not with apologies, but with a message from a cousin, asking why Carla had just posted a fundraiser with a caption about unexpected medical expenses, and I felt a calm settle over me as I typed my answer, because the next move would not be public or loud, but it would be unforgettable. The fundraiser sat there on my screen with a smiling family photo and a caption about sudden hardship that made it sound like lightning had struck out of a clear sky. And as I read the part about how my parents were facing unexpected medical bills and how every little bit would help keep them afloat during this difficult season, I felt that familiar heat in my chest that used to push me into paying first and asking questions never, because the story was shaped to trigger rescue impulses in people like me, except this time I was not going to step into the same role, and I scrolled through the donations with their encouraging messages and the share count that was climbing, and I realized Carla had done exactly what Carla always does, which is take a private responsibility and turn it into a public performance with applause built in, while quietly expecting me to plug the actual hole behind the scenes so her stage never floods. I could have written a long comment explaining how those bills were not new, how they had been managed for years, how the only new factor was the sudden discovery that the free pipeline was now dry, but airing it out in the comments would have turned into a spectacle. And I do not need a crowd to know I am right, so I took a breath and did what I do best, which is deal with the system that feeds the story rather than the story itself, and I opened the fundraiser support page and read the guidelines like they were an assignment at work, and right there in clean language it said that campaigns must be truthful and not misrepresent prior financial support or the existence of alternate funding sources, and that proofs may be requested and that reports should include documentation, and I thought, fine, let us play by the rules Carla forgot to read. I filed a report that was as unemotional as a receipt, attaching a tidy packet with redacted statements showing the long history of auto-pays from my account, a copy of my email to my mother confirming the change in responsibility, and a short note explaining that the medical situation was chronic and stable, that services were not at risk of immediate interruption, and that the fundraiser framed it as an emergency caused by sudden bills when the truth was that a private donor, me, had withdrawn after being excluded from family decisions. And I added that I had already provided the household with a step-by-step guide to assume payment and with contact information for a financial assistance office that could help evaluate discounts based on income. So donors were not being asked to prevent a catastrophe so much as to maintain a lifestyle in which accountability is optional. And I clicked submit and closed the tab without a flourish, because the point was not to humiliate anyone publicly. It was to stop a misleading money machine before it turned into another lie I would be expected to carry. Then I called the financial assistance office at the hospital, the one that lives in the world between charity and billing where they actually help if you treat them with respect, and I explained that my parents would be calling soon to apply, that they had a reliable address and steady retirement income, that they might qualify for a reduction, and the woman on the line, who sounded like she had been through every story people tell when they are scared, said she would put notes on both accounts and flag them for a fast review once the applications arrived, and she thanked me for giving them a heads up because, as she put it, families sometimes get lost between pride and panic, and I told her that sounded about right, and hung up feeling like I had secured a path that did not depend on my credit card or Carla's publicity tour. I sent my mother and father a simple email with the application links and the office hours, adding that I had spoken to a representative who would expect their call, and I was careful with my words because I wanted to remove every excuse. So I wrote in plain language that the process was manageable and that I would sit with them one afternoon, to complete it together if needed, after which they would be able to handle renewals themselves, and I left it there because that is the line now. One lesson, not a lifetime subscription to my labor, and a few minutes later my phone rang with my mother's name, and I let it go to voicemail, which is a skill I have learned like a person learning to stand after a long injury. Because once you answer you are back in the spin cycle, and I am not doing that anymore. Within an hour the fundraiser changed, the photo disappeared, the text shifted to something vaguer about appreciation and seasonal stress, and a banner at the top said the campaign was under review. And my cousin texted me a screenshot with a string of question marks followed by one line that made me almost laugh, which said that Carla was telling people there had been a misunderstanding with the platform and that haters had reported her. And I replied that I hoped the review would help clarify everything and that the best way to help our parents would be to reach out to them directly or, better yet, to drop off a prepaid card with their name on it, which is what I did right then, walking into the grocery store, loading a card with a clean amount, writing a calm note that said this is a one-time gift to bridge you to your assistance approval. Please use it for copays only. Love, your daughter. And I drove to their mailbox and slid it in because I am not trying to starve anyone of care. I am trying to starve a story that feeds on me. Carla called 10 times in a row after that and then switched to texting, alternating between friendly and furious, saying I had embarrassed the family and cost our parents support and made her look like a fool, and I wrote back once, A single paragraph that said I have provided a safe and lawful path for them to manage their medical costs, that the fundraiser misrepresented facts and would have pulled money from people under false assumptions, that her anger belonged to her and not to me, and that I would not discuss this again, and I put my phone down and made dinner, because life goes on even when the circus is in town, and as I was stacking plates the hospital number popped up on the screen. And I answered, because I respect institutions that keep records, and the representative said my mother had tried to add me back as guarantor and authorize my card, and she wanted to confirm my consent before processing, and I said no. And he said understood, and I hung up knowing that the next call I got would not be from a system, it would be from the person who hates being told no most of all, and I was ready to let her talk until she ran out of air, because my next move would not require permission, only timing. The next day I did exactly what I had promised and not 1 inch more, which meant I drove over to my parents for a single afternoon with my laptop and a short agenda printed in large fonts, because I had decided that if they wanted me present it would be as a trainer, not a human ATM, and when I walked in my mother tried the old routine with the soft eyes and the careful hints about timing and how this month was just unusually tight. And I said we would start with the insurance portal and move through the pharmacy and the hospital, and then we would be done, and I sat them at the table like adults who can learn a system, because they are, and for the first time in years I did not take the mouse or the phone out of their hands. I just coached, slow and clear, while they typed their own usernames and reset their own passwords and wrote their own security questions on a sheet that they would keep, because this is their account and their life and their bills, and if that sounds cold to anyone listening, it is only because they do not know the years I have already given to doing these exact steps for them while being told not to make a fuss about it. We called the specialty pharmacy together and I spoke when needed to explain the change, but I let my father be the voice on the account, and when the representative asked for a billing contact and a card, my father hesitated and looked at me like a kid glancing at the teacher, and I said very calmly that it should be whoever coordinates his household budget, and he said Carla handles the bills now, which was news to me but not a surprise. And he read out her number while my mother fetched the card she uses for shopping, and we put the phone on speaker so there would be no confusion later about what was said and what was agreed to. And the representative repeated the new contact information and explained that reminders and balance notices would go to that number and email. And I watched my parents nod like this was a normal thing and not a tectonic shift where the ringing phone and the little red badge of unread messages would land on the daughter who prefers declarations over responsibilities, and I felt something inside me unclench. Not because I wanted Carla to suffer, but because sunlight and responsibility tend to clear infections faster than denial and whispers. Then we called the hospital billing office and asked that the guarantor be updated to the patient as it should have been all along, and the representative, who had a professional warmth that felt like a life raft, walked my mother through setting up a payment plan that did not need me at any point, and then transferred us to financial assistance, where the woman I had spoken to the day before came on the line, kind and efficient. And she asked a few questions about income and assets and promised to email the application forms, and my mother wrote down the list of documents to bring and said she could handle it, and for the first time in years I believed her, not because she wanted to, but because I had removed the escape hatch. And there is a funny thing that happens when you stop being the emergency contact for other people's choices, which is that they discover they are capable of more than they claimed. Somewhere between the second call and the third, my phone started buzzing with Carla's name and then unknown numbers that I recognized as call forwarding from the pharmacy, which meant the contact change was already propagating. And I let them go to voicemail because this was not her meeting and I was not about to let her narrate it from the driveway, and I finished the session by setting a simple written rule with my parents that said they would not put my name, my email, or my card on any medical or financial account again, not as a guarantor, not as a backup, not as a temporary fix, and I had them initial it like a contract, not because I planned to waive it in court, but because sometimes families need a physical line to understand that a boundary is real. On my way out I saw the little holiday centerpiece on the entry table, and I thought about how many years I had placed gifts around it while skimming statements with one eye, making sure there were no surprises hiding under the tinsel of good cheer. And I felt the old urge to apologize for being firm, to soften the edges, to promise extra help after the holidays, and I let that urge pass like a wave, because if I have learned anything in this mess, it is that apologies are the currency people demand when they are losing access to your labor, and I am not paying in that currency anymore. I am paying in clarity, and clarity has a way of making the noise fall away. On the drive home, my phone finally lit up with a string of messages that told me the story had jumped its track. Because Carla had discovered she was the new contact for the pharmacy and the hospital and was informing me that I had gone too far and that I had humiliated her and that she would not be handling this because she has a life. And I replied with a paragraph that said the accounts reflected the reality she announced when she curated a holiday for the successful ones that adults manage. The consequences of their choices, that our parents now had a plan and a pending assistance application, and that the pharmacy and the hospital were ready to work with whoever picked up the phone, and I left it there. Because I will not argue with a person who needs attention more than solutions. An hour later, a cousin sent me a screenshot showing that the fundraiser had been pulled down with a generic note about policy review, and under it someone had asked in a community thread why it was deleted and whether the need was fake. And before I could even think about what to say, my father called and asked me, in a smaller voice than I have heard in years, to come by on Christmas Eve for a short family meeting because things had gotten tense and there were hurt feelings and they wanted to fix it. And I said I was not available on Christmas Eve, but that I would send something that would help everyone see the same picture at once. And as I hung up, I opened the folder I had compiled with 10 years of receipts and confirmations and notes. And I began shaping them into a single clean document that says very little and proves everything, and I set a send time that would land when the performance hit its peak, and I closed my laptop with a calm I did not know I could feel, because the final move was ready and no one would see it coming until it already mattered. I sent it at the exact minute I knew they would be raising glasses and doing that thing where people make little speeches about gratitude that somehow manage to sound like resumes, because I wanted my words to arrive right when the script was the most polished. And I kept the subject line simple and clean so no one could accuse me of drama, and it said in plain language that this was a clarity note to the family regarding medical bills, holiday plans, and the meaning of success as practiced in our house, and the body was nothing flowery or explosive, just a calm narration of facts with attachments that did the talking better than I ever could, which is funny because for years I thought that if I explained enough I could make people see me, when really it was always going to be the receipts that broke the trance. I opened by saying that I hoped they were enjoying their intimate celebration of high achievers, and that I wanted to make sure everyone who had an opinion also had information. Because opinions without information tend to turn into careless stories that get posted, shared, and weaponized against whoever is too tired to fight back. And then I laid out, in a handful of long paragraphs, the pattern that had held for nearly a decade, where I had paid for insurance shortfalls recurring, prescriptions, follow-up visits, and surprise imaging that somehow always surprised the same people, and I wrote that I had never asked for applause or repayment because I believed that family steps in quietly when things are rough. But that quiet support had been rebranded as lack of ambition and negative energy, and that rebrand was the part one could not let stand. Not anymore. Not after being told with a straight face that Christmas was for the successful ones and that my presence would interfere with the vibe. Then, without accusation or insult, I attached the documents that matter in the only courtroom that ever counts in families like ours, the courtroom of undeniable proof. So there were the confirmations of automatic payments with the payer line highlighted. There were the emails where I negotiated discounts. There were the call summaries where I was listed as the contact and guarantor. There were the portal screenshots showing my cards, and on the last page there was a concise ledger that totaled the quiet support by year with the notes on the days it mattered most, like when a follow-up scan got greenlit because a balance had vanished, and I did not comment on the total because the total was not the point. The point was to end the fairy tale where my sister floats through life on merit alone and my parents host on dignity alone, while I somehow fail to measure up to the very standard I am single-handedly funding. I wrote that I had ended my role as guarantor and payer and that every relevant institution now required authorization and payment from the household. And I included the names and numbers of the people in financial assistance who were ready to help once the application was submitted, and I explained that I had already provided one final bridge in the form of a prepaid card for copays, and that any attempt to add my information back without my consent would be declined and reported, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because boundaries are meaningless if they are not enforced, and I closed that section with one line that felt like the hinge on a door finally swinging to where it should have been all along, which said that my care for my parents remains intact, but my sponsorship of other people's image projects does not. Because I know how fast Carla moves when she is cornered, I also wrote a short note regarding the fundraiser, stating that I had asked the platform to review it for accuracy and that they were handling it according to policy, and that any family member who wished to help could do so directly by sending a payment to the hospital or by buying a pharmacy credit in my parents' names, which would be the adult version of support. And I added that gossip did not count as help and never had, and that if anyone needed further clarification, the attachments would answer their questions without the need for commentary or spin, and I signed it with my full name because I wanted it clear that a grown woman sent this and stood by it. I set the recipients to my parents, my sister, the two aunts who act like a news channel, and the cousins who love a good narrative, and I left out the few people who never engage in anything except private texts asking for screenshots. Because I am done feeding entertainment, and after I hit send I put my phone face down and made myself something simple to eat, and I let the first wave of calls roll straight to voicemail, because I already knew what they would say, that I had ruined the night, that I had embarrassed the family, that I had made them look small in front of people, and here is the thing I have finally learned that I wish someone had taught me years ago, which is that truth does not make you small, it just makes your costume unnecessary. And if you are tiny without the costume, that is not the truth's fault. When I finally checked my phone, there were messages from the cousins whose default setting is performance, now quietly writing that they had no idea, that they were sorry, that they felt sick reading the totals, and the dates they remembered celebrating something else on. And there were 2 emails from the aunts, one defensive and one surprisingly honest, and there was a short text from my father that said he had read everything twice, and that he would handle his business, and there was a longer one from my mother that wavered between anger and pleading and ended with a line about how she did not raise me to be cruel, and I stared at that sentence for a long time and realized that this was the trick that kept me docile. The conflation of clarity with cruelty, of boundaries with betrayal, of adulthood with coldness, and I replied once, with a paragraph that said I loved her and that I was done subsidizing disrespect, and that if she wanted to repair the relationship she could start by speaking about me in ways that matched the facts, and that there would be no more back-channel fixes for problems created by pride. Carla tried one more stunt, a syrupy voicemail about the spirit of the season and how families should keep disagreements private, which was funny given the public fundraiser, and I decided to give her exactly one answer. So I called back and spoke in the same even tone I have used with billing departments for years, telling her that I was not interested in apologies rehearsed for an audience, that what I wanted was new behavior. And that new behavior looks like handling the pharmacy reminders that now arrive on her phone, paying the balance plans that have her as the contact, and refraining from labeling people unsuccessful while living on their invisible work. And when she started to talk about tone and intention, I told her we were done for now and that if she wanted a different relationship she could build one from scratch without borrowing my credit or my reputation, and I hung up with my hands steady, which is how I knew I had already won. In the days that followed, the calls slowed, the fundraiser disappeared, the assistance application got submitted, the first payment plan installment was made without my card anywhere near it, and the family group thread went silent in that heavy way that means people are recalibrating, and I decided not to fill the silence with explanations or consolations or jokes to smooth the edges, because the edges are the point. They mark the place where I end and other people begin, and on New Year's Day I woke up to a short message from my father that said my name and thank you, and that was it, and for once I let the simplicity be enough, because the plan had worked exactly as designed, quiet and clean and decisive. And if there are still people in my orbit wondering whether I went too far, I hope they keep wondering while they pay their own bills, because the last move of the game is always the same and it is never loud. It is just the moment you stop auditioning for a seat at a table you built and you take your chair with you when you leave.